welcome to a special new feature here on the podcast, the monthly recap. We are recapping the month of February. I hope you had a chance to listen to the January's recap. We're trying something a little different, and we hope you'll find it useful. We know that not everyone has time to listen to every episode, and honestly, I wouldn't expect you to. Sometimes just a title isn't enough to know if an episode is right for you. That's where the recap comes in. I am joined once again by one of my favorite listeners who has become a friend and an occasional co-host here on the podcast, Jen Singh. Together, we will be reflecting on the February episodes. They were 4 episodes. We'll talk about what we liked, key takeaways from each episode, and which ones stood out the most for us. Maybe you'll hear our thoughts on why an episode resonated with us personally or didn't. We'll also discuss whether there was an episode or topic that didn't quite hit the mark. And of course, we'll share why someone should listen to each episode, what the key takeaway or value might be. Finally, we'll answer the big question. If we were recommending just one episode from this month to a brand new listener, which one would it be and why? If you're a regular listener and would love to join me for a future recap, I would love to have you here. Reach out and let me know. I'm always looking for new voices to join the conversation. Please enjoy. And thank you for listening. So here we are, the month of February. We had 4 episodes this month, starting with episode 440, Mothering Challenging Adult Children, Navigating Guilt, Conflict, and Change with Dr. Judith Smith. Then we had episode 441, Mastering the Art of Validation, How to Make People Feel Seen and Understood with Caroline Fleck, PhD. Then we had episode 442, 7 Ways to Improve Well-Being, Reduce Stress, and Stay Grounded in Difficult Times with my dear friend, Laura Froyen. And the last one in the month of February is episode 443, The Truth About Menopause, Symptoms, Solutions, and Finding the Gifts in Midlife with Thompson Fadal. So my first question to you is, which one was your favorite this month and why?
My favorite was the validation episode. Every episode had a spot that was new and interesting, and I can't wait to talk with you about those things. But the validation talked about these new concepts around validating in different degrees, which is so helpful because it can be difficult psychologically for me to want to validate somebody I'm not agreeing with. So I really loved that those different degrees that were mentioned and framing it in a way that make validation easier. It's a skill that we can build, and there's a path to do the easy stuff first and get the more complicated stuff later. It laid out a path that I really, really liked.
Excellent. Well, my favorite from this month, it's kind of hard to choose a favorite, as we all know, but I'm going to choose it anyway. Mine was the episode with Laura Froyen. Number one, I love Laura as a friend, as a colleague. And, it's been a long time since we did an episode with her. And I thought this was a really wonderful episode with so many practical tips, especially for today's world. It seems like everybody's on edge, stressed, overwhelmed, burned out. And I thought, this was a good episode. Even though we've talked about those tips before in various episodes over the years, I still felt like it was a nice roundup of tools and tips that we shared both. And I loved hearing how she practices, stress reduction and mindfulness and how she stays grounded. It was a fun and light and I hope helpful episode.
That's great. I enjoyed that one a lot too. As you said, it's hard to pick a favorite.
So let's start with the first one, which is the first one of the month, the, mothering challenging adult daughters. I was thinking about you because you live with your parents. Obviously you don't have the same setup, but this episode, tell me what were your takeaways, what you just thought about this episode, because it's an unusual topic, a rare spoken topic. And this was a pitch, I was pitched this guest and the book was sent to me at first, like I put it aside. I, ignored it. I'm like, who is interested in this? I'm not going to read this book. But when I had time to dig in, I'm like, wow, like I want to shed light. I want to raise awareness. This is such an important issue. So, as a listener, how did this episode land on you and what were your takeaways?
Yeah, you're right. I don't have adult children. I don't have difficult adult children. I do have difficult, I guess, complicated, sensitive children. So I imagine that I'll be mothering them in ways that foretold in this episode, in as they become adults, because they are likely to have need for me to be helping them and supporting them for much longer than typical kids. What I really loved about this episode was the acknowledgement of the feelings that are, as you said, not often talked about, and that ambivalence, that worry, all mothers worry, all mothers have torn feelings, but it's a whole other level with children that are experiencing these kinds of issues, and the impact that it would have on my identity as a mother, being, even if it's quote only emotional abuse, right? Being abused by adult children is something that these mothers experience. And I sent this episode link right away to a support group that I go to, my employer arranged actually, which I thought was really fantastic, connecting other parents who have children with mental challenges and disabilities. And those parents in that group are in this situation. Many of them have very difficult adult children that they have to figure out where those boundaries are, how much support to give, when to stop supporting, when we need to invoke tough love. It's such a difficult thing to deal with. So I really was grateful that you had this guest and talked about this topic, because it was something that I found useful to think about, even as a mother of children. Acknowledging those feelings. Again, these are topics that we've covered in other episodes. Feel your feelings and label them to understand them better, and all of those things. A lot of that stuff was in here as well. But in the context of this issue, it was such a great reminder. It was really, really helpful.
Yeah. What stood out to me was the term difficult, right? Difficult daughters or difficult, not daughters, difficult children, adult children. I think it was non-pathologizing. There's no better way of describing this relationship, this complexity, this issue other than difficult. I felt so heavy after this interview. I remember I walked away with the feeling of, I think I covered enough. I did a good job, but I felt so heavy. But then when I thought about it longer, I felt hopeful because Dr. Judith herself has so many resources and she runs support groups for mothers who are in this situation, who are being even abused by their adult children. It's hard. Like nobody talks about this. And I thought I did a good job of talking about this, raising awareness. What stood out to me, where she talked about the difference between verbal abuse and emotional abuse. But the best part was, the entire time during this interview, I was like itching to ask how personal this issue is for her. Because as you know, like people write books, nonfiction books, usually because they're dear to their heart, near the topic or some kind of personal connection, right? And because she was an older woman, I just didn't know how to say it. It's just a challenging thing. But I think I managed towards the end to ask, what's your personal connection to this topic? And sure enough, there was, and I was blown away. So I wish I had asked that question earlier so I could have known a little more, as, I love learning about people's lives, but I think that was sufficient. And she talked about maternal guilt and the, societal expectations and how it's all on the mother's shoulders, right? Fathers are not held to the same expectations and standards for adult children as mothers. That was like this big takeaway. And I walked away thinking, wow, when you're a parent, you are a parent forever. Whether you have difficult children, adult children, whatever the type, you're always in it. Like when our children grow up, turn 18 and leave the nest, doesn't mean we're done. It never stops. So those were my takeaways from this episode.
Yeah, I like those.
Anything else before we move to the next one?
Only that I appreciate you calling it a hopeful episode. I found the same thing to be true. And I think that's what compelled me to share it with my support group friends was that there are things that we can do within our own control that can make the situation more bearable. It will always be difficult, but some of the things that we need to do to find support can be truly helpful.
Yes. Okay, so the next episode was your favorite, which was also one of my favorites too, the validation episode. The validation episode, again, towards the end, my favorite parts are always towards the end. And I hope the listener listens always to the end because some gems and wonderful insight usually happens at the last moment or towards the end. And here, this author, upon completing her book, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And as you might know, people don't know what to say to young people who have diseases, or we're not good at validating people, period, right? It's not a skill that we have mastered. And so I was going to ask her, how did people, sympathize or empathize with her? But I'm glad it came up towards the end. And she said, I also enjoyed the part about self-validation and the latter, that how systematic this learning this skill was, something I think you might, you enjoy learning. We all love formulas, systems, structure. So I never thought about validation like that is deep and layered and structured. And it has, this ladder, 8 skills grouped together. And so I really appreciated that. Another takeaway for me was the notion of acceptance and change. Before we can change or before change can happen, we need to accept. And that brought my attention to the topic radical acceptance, our live event. And I think I mentioned in this episode. And the other key idea for me was validation is not an agreement. When you validate someone, it does not automatically mean that you're agreeing with them. So many people, I think, have this, wrong. And I thought this was a really wonderful episode. Your thoughts, your takeaways?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned already that same ladder, different levels of validation. And I do love myself a system anytime. That was wonderful. And thinking about validation as different from agreement is something I knew cognitively. Intellectually, I know that it's not the same as agreeing. But when she later made the connection to making sure that we're validating what's going on in the person's inner world, it was much more clear to me that your inner world is your own thing always. And the reason I might ask questions in order to be able to validate is so that I can understand the inner world. And no wonder that's such a connective experience then, because anytime we're trying to understand a person's inner world, opening our inner world to somebody, that's going to be a point of strong connection and safety, and especially if it's treated gently with validation first, fantastic. So I just loved that concept of thinking that validation supports connection in this way, that we can ask questions even when we're trying to validate if we're using this skill adequately. She talked about some pitfalls too in the episode, and that validation is different from problem solving. It's not even a step towards problem solving necessarily. Sometimes when people are sharing their inner world, right, their complaints, their issues, their joys, whatever is being shared with us as as a relationship partner that may or may not mean that there's a problem to solve at all. It's a completely separate experience. She talked also, there was a quote that I wrote down, the validate the valid. Look for what is valid. There's something valid here, even if the person is on a completely opposite perspective than I might hold, then I can look for what part of this can I validate. And she equated that with a mindfulness exercise. First, being mindful about I'm looking for something here that is valid. I'm going to listen carefully until I find something valid that I can validate. That might be simply their line of reasoning. It might, well, not likely if it's a completely different perspective, but it might be the feelings that they have given their line of reasoning. It might be any number of things, but we can listen in a way that gives us something to validate. I really, really liked this episode.
Yeah, we validate feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and sometimes not all at the same time, right? I thought we both talked about our clients. Sometimes I hear clients have convoluted ideas. They want you to agree with them, but when I listen deeply, I excavate the emotion and validate that, not their thoughts. And so I thought there was a really good distinction there for someone who wants to learn this skill in order to apply with others and with their children specifically. I think this is a really good episode. Anything else before we move to the menopause episode? Or not the menopause, well, the next episode was the 7 ways to reduce stress and increase well-being, however I titled it. So, what were your main takeaways and how did this resonate with you personally? I know as part of our support group, we've talked about increasing well-being so much that like I know you personally and deeply. But so I was going to ask you one thing before we jump to the takeaways. You texted me something very like mysterious, cryptic. You said, in this month recap, there is one episode, and I'm like, which one is it? Is it the mothering? Is it this episode? So I'm dying to know what was that cryptic message about?
It was this validation episode. I so much wanted to talk with you about this one. So
Oh,
I'm glad we
okay.
just got to do that. And I hope that the conversation in the Facebook group supports my interest in this episode too. I might just have to brag about it a little more when this recap is released as well.
Yeah, yeah. I would listen to that episode again. And the book was great too. Even though she doesn't in the validation book, she doesn't give you a lot of like conversations, how to's, and like real life examples. I felt like the book was good. I felt like it felt short a little bit. I wanted like real life examples, how validation works, how the skills that she talks about, but that wasn't provided. Maybe that's not possible for all situations, right? I don't know what the reasoning was. But, anyways, so let's go to the increasing well-being episode.
Yeah, early on in this episode, you and Laura talked about one distinction that was really very helpful between local worries and global worries, worrying about the things going on in the world, the big issues, the climate change, the political atmosphere, the disasters happening elsewhere in the world. Those are valid, speaking of validating, things to worry about. It is our world. This is where we live. And there are some things we can do to make changes in these places. But when it comes time to maintain our own well being, it may not be wise to let those global worries enter our world uncontrolled. We want to make sure that we have made a deliberate decision about how we're going to view those things. And local worries, on the other hand, are the things that are much closer to home. They're our homes and families and our neighborhoods and our school districts and some of the things that are much closer to home. Those problems don't need to be as carefully filtered out as the global ones do because the control we have over them is generally so much greater. Even if it's not a control over the problem, right? It's control over the way that we engage with those problems. So I think that was one of the biggest takeaways for me and that I've been thinking about more and more as the episode simmers in my mind was that local versus global. And again, I love a system. So maybe that's part of why is having two buckets that I can put things into. There were plenty of other tips and practices that were mentioned in here, but that's the one that I've really been thinking about.
Yeah, and stemming from that, that was my idea. I've been, thinking about this a lot lately as, I interact with people and work with parents. It stood out to me that many people are like swept and just sort of like are stewing in the global bucket more. And they sort of lose their resourcefulness and their capacity to be present and useful in their local domain where they more likely have control. And so that creates burnout in turn. And so I've been observing this, and I thought this was a perfect episode to share my idea. And then stemming from that thought, we talked about capacity versus impact and preserving your inner resources so that you can be effective in your local domain, in your home. That's where you have control. And like you said, the episode had so many wonderful tips from prayer, meditation, solitude, cleaning and organizing your home. I shared that. And I thought it was a great episode and a light episode. I didn't want it to be heavy. I thought it was practical, and hopefully people will pick and choose what works for them. So,
Yeah, to that point, you all talked a lot about social media use, and you have a common view on social media and the way that it can bring worries in front of us that we may not want to receive that way. And I I don't have a very solid philosophy on social media like you do, but I did find that that's one of the things that I kind of shrugged at and I was like, that's not my thing. But there were plenty of other things that I can do, just as you said, pick and choose what works for them. It feels perfectly fine that I don't completely agree with the social media perspective that you both hold, but I do agree with the nervous system regulation perspectives, for example, that were mentioned in here. So,
yeah. And the worry window.
the worry window.
I also shared that you can worry about things because if you try not to worry about things, people always say, don't worry about it, don't worry. But no, my mind is going to worry and it's going to get bigger. So give yourself like time to worry window and write it down, vent with someone, but have that window. Don't let that color your day, your weeks. It's easier said than done, let's face it. I know this myself, but I think when you think about this from this perspective that I'm going to give myself a worry window, then you sort of, we know control is an illusion. We never have full control, but at least that gives you comfort that you did something towards that worry. So yeah. Anything else before we move to the last episode of the month?
The comment about the worry window just makes me think of a similar book about I can't remember the title fully, but it ended with something about steps towards a complaint-free world. And he talked about complaints in a similar way as worrying that we just discussed, that having a window of time to complain makes it a whole lot easier to not complain elsewhere during the day because it really often doesn't help much, makes us feel a little bit better, the same way that worrying makes it feel a little bit better. But it's a very parallel thought that didn't dawn on me until we were talking just now about the worry window.
Yeah, the thing about complaint is, I have a pet peeve when people complain. It drives me insane for some reason. I have issues around it. Well, there are people who complain a lot, right? They're the complainers, that type of complaining, not just regular, because we all complain. But I feel like, complaining, it's a learned strategy. We complain because there is a need underneath that is not being met, and we don't know how to communicate effectively. We learn to complain to get that need met. I think when we shift that perspective and figure out how to voice that need, I'm thinking of Yvette Erasmus and all the wonderful like teachings that she does. I think dynamic between people changes significantly and the complaints, disappear. Like there's no need to complain. You can just voice and say, what is it that you need? But we learn early on in our childhood to use the complaint to get attention, to get whatever need that we have to get met. Right. Anyways, that's a whole different thing. But let's talk about menopause. I'm glad I covered this topic. This guest was very dynamic and interesting. I felt like I didn't do a good job as an interviewer in this episode. I felt like there was so much more to be talked about. I haven't listened to it yet, but I walked away feeling like, did I cover it well? Like I had doubts. It's a rich topic. Obviously, we can't talk about everything, but I learned some things from the book. The book is very well written and fantastic. What stood out to me, I learned that there are many more symptoms to menopause than the hot flashes. There are almost 100, over 100 symptoms to menopause. I learned about hormonal treatment, which I was oblivious, I have to say. I didn't know that once you agree to hormonal treatment, it's like forever. I thought it was temporary. I didn't know that. I loved the fact that we talked about fears and the gifts, and that this episode was not a negative portrayal of menopause. I learned about vaginal estrogen. I had no idea that such thing exists. So it opened my eyes as a woman. It's sad that we have to learn these things later in life. I was like, but I'm glad people are advocating and talking about menopause. Menopause is having a moment in our culture, so to speak. Many books are being written and all of that. Those were my main takeaways. How about yours?
Yes, I haven't read this book, How to Menopause, but I did recently get partway through The New Menopause, a similar topic where it talked a lot about symptoms we might not normally think of and some of the newer research around hormone replacement therapy, hormone therapy, and how I didn't realize that what I knew about those topics is very outdated. I'm not in menopause, I'm not in premenopause, but so I have no reason to know the newest information anyway, but now I do. So it was nice to rehear some of the same topics from that other book because putting the two side by side, it's always helpful, almost like a second opinion, right? When I hear the some radical information and discover it's maybe not as radical as it seems to me because other authors and other researchers are writing about the same things. So it's just new to me, but not new to the world, new to the field. In this episode too, they talked about the symptoms could even start a lot earlier than many people think in the late 30s or early 40s. Well, now we're in my in my age point, so maybe I am having symptoms that I'm just attributing to other things, which is something we do tend to do. So I'm glad that I have some information about this topic now that I didn't have till I had done some reading and listening on it. It talked about some lifestyle changes too, the nutrition and sleep and exercise. And when I hear that kind of advice, I, I tend to roll my eyes like, of course, all of that's important. I'm already doing the best I can in those areas. But I suppose these are the areas where we all could always do better. And that's a me thing, trying to make sure that I'm not dismissing the efforts I am making because I'm not achieving goals that I wish I could with respect to nutrition and sleep and exercise. But knowing that it can make such a huge difference in so many different areas of life, I suppose, is the reminder that we all need now and then.
Yeah, no, I agree. Lifestyle changes. I concur from my own experience, right? I'm almost 51 this year. I'll be 51. I know, I am right in this category. And I know how lifestyle and nutrition it plays a big role. Like I don't have huge symptoms like the one that she described in her book. And I know some people have like more severe symptoms. For example, Black women, that was a shock to learn. They start menopause, perimenopause early. They have severe lasting symptoms and it was shocking to learn those things, but I know that lifestyle changes can make a big difference, but it's like the same information, sleep better, eat well, exercise. Like we know that, but it's hard to do.
It is hard to do.
It is hard to do. I think this episode is not only good for people like us or who are in perimenopause and menopausal women, but I think this is a good episode for women in general. Even if you're in your 30s, 20s, late 20s, you're going to hit perimenopause at some point. I think we need to be educated, empowered, learn about those things. And it's also good information for our partners, our husbands and men who are listening to the podcast, the dads, to understand their women partners. This is an important thing. And so I thought it's important to cover this. A listener called me recently and they said, "Oh, I just discovered your podcast about parenting, blah, blah, blah. But the latest episode is about menopause." I said, "Well, how do I explain what this podcast is all about?" And so, yes, this is an important aspect because we're people, we're moms who are going to experience menopause, and it's going to affect us, our parenting. It's important to cover this. So anything else you want to say about any of the episodes before I ask you an important question?
No, go right ahead.
So if you were to recommend to a new listener one of these 4 episodes to introduce the podcast to them, which one would it be?
I think it would be the episode that you did with Laura on improving well-being. That's probably because it is so far-flung in terms of topics and suggestions, and it brings together many of the episodes that any one of these topics could be discussed in much more detail. I imagine if you made a related to this podcast like widget on your website or something, this is an episode that would go all over the place. You can't see my hands in the audio, but I'm flying them around the room because you could go to so many different areas from if any of these topics were interesting to hear more about.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't recommend the mothering challenging adult daughters or the menopause to a new listener. They would be completely lost out there. Maybe the validation, but I agree. Since it's a parenting podcast, I have to agree. I would recommend that episode. Well, another question, and this is the last one. Was there an episode or topic that didn't quite hit the mark for you? Do you have critical thoughts the way maybe I handled the interview, or maybe I missed something?
No, I couldn't think of anything.
Good. Yay.
I always want to have something to tell you that could use some improvement because you're as interested in improvement as I am, but I just often don't find anything. I guess I'm so self-absorbed in the listening that I'm thinking only about myself and how to apply these, and I don't think so much about you and what I would like to hear differently. This was an excellent month, though. When I reviewed which 4 episodes was going to be discussed, I did kind of, wow, this was a fantastic month.
Oh, wow. Great. That wasn't my takeaway. I was like, wow, how is this going to land with the listeners? But I'm glad you are, lifting my spirits. The next one, March, is going to be even more fantastic. I know what's coming. So I'm excited for that. But I want to thank you deeply for being present, for taking the time and not only listening to all 4 episodes, taking notes but recording this with me. This is such an immense pleasure and honor, and I really value you and I love you, Jen.
Aw, thanks. You're very welcome. I love you too.
Okay, until next month.
Take care.